I have been in many roles with iSpark. I started out as the Team BC coordinator to provincial coordinator performance sports, and now I serve as a contract with iSpark. I do see a couple of messages in the comment section, and I can get to you as soon as we wrap up the introductions. So we just kindly ask that everyone's mics are off and that this session is recorded and it's uploaded to our YouTube channel and the iSpark website. And so if you would not like your face on any of those channels, just remain with your camera off. And then for anyone that is having trouble and would like a call in, I saw there was a couple of questions about that. I can pop in that number into the chat as well, send out a reminder email to everyone as well. So I'm going to hand it over. For anyone who's wondering, Julie is our iSpark intern. If you have more than one person joining your chat room, if you could just let Julie know so that she can mark that down for statistics. And just thank you, Pacific Sport Okanagan and Geoff, and so excited to have you again. And let's begin. I'll let you take it away and wow us with with your information.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, Alyssa. It's great to be here, everyone, and good evening. So my name is Geoff Hackett, and I'm coming to you from Nanaimo, BC, and I'm just very grateful to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the lands of the Sindemuk people here, and I'm very excited to reconnect with iSpark. I believe I did a talk for athletes last year around some mental skills that they can use in sport. And obviously over this past almost 11 months since I did that talk, the situation for athletes, the message has obviously changed, and there's been a lot of disappointing situations regarding Indigenous sport in Canada, specifically around cancellation of the North American Indigenous Games in Halifax. And so what tonight is really about is just a discussion around, obviously there's lots of uncomfortable feelings and difficult emotions to process, but what are some strategies that we can use to move forward? An essential part of kind of developing some resilience in these situations is understanding how we can establish connection with people, and how as parents it can be an extremely difficult time because you just feel very helpless in certain situations where your child is really lost and they've lost a huge experience in their life and don't know how and when that opportunity may present itself again. And so what I mean to do tonight is just kind of outline a little bit around how we can have some of these discussions and what are some practical things that don't necessarily provide all the answers. And I want to make that clear is that this talk isn't really meant to provide a solution for everyone, but it's meant to provide maybe a bit of a framework in terms of how we can approach this difficult situation. As a parent, I'm trying to connect with your child in this situation. So, like Alyssa mentioned, I come to you from Pacific Sport, which is one of 5 different centers across the province that essentially service athletes and coaches and community members across British Columbia. And so we are like a partner of iSpark, and we kind of work together on these sort of initiatives around providing education for athletes, coaches, parents, specifically related to different parts of sport. And so you may be familiar with Dr. Shauna Taylor, who's like a colleague of mine, and she works at the Pacific Sport Okanagan Center there in Kelowna. And so I'm over on Vancouver Island. And I guess one of the an interesting thing about COVID is that we're able to connect online, which I'm sure everyone's pretty sick of at this point, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to tune in. And it's just really always grateful to reconnect and to make new connections with people across the province who wouldn't normally get to really have these opportunities to speak to. So thank you for joining. Just a little bit more information, just so you know where I'm coming from and what my role is I like in many people that work in sport, I have many different kind of roles that I do, and sometimes it can get a little busy, sometimes it gets a little crazy, but I kind of work in 3 different levels of sport. And so I come to you from a background in mental performance. I'm a mental performance consultant. And so what that means is I work with athletes, coaches, and teams on providing strategies to manage with the demands and pressures of sport. And so this topic tonight isn't really related to anything to do with performance, but it's related to do with what are some skills and what are some ways in which parents and athletes can use in this difficult time. And so from a kind of a local sport perspective, I mentioned I have a few different things. I'm a soccer guy. I coach a lot at Autonomy United, which is our big soccer club here in town. From a provincial level, I'm a coordinator and a mental performance consultant with Pacific Sport, and I'm also on the Team BC group as well for the Canada Summer Games, which are going to happen next year in Niagara. And then from a national sport perspective, I work at the Canadian Sport Institute as a mental performance consultant as well. So I kind of vary in my day-to-day about the different levels that I pop in and out of. But today is really around just connecting from more of like a provincial level and really kind of outlining, you know, we have really high-end athletes that we're working with in our province, and you know they're obviously not really having the greatest time of sport right now, just because there's so many barriers in place. And we hope that it changes, but it's almost, you know, there's no guarantees of when that's going to be. So for this kind of talk tonight, it's really just around making sure that we establish that connection as a starting point before we can really start to outline, you know, solutions for an athlete. And so I'm going to definitely explain how that looks in a little bit more context. For tonight, you know, this is a big thing that I think it's important for everyone to understand, is that the relationship between a coach and an athlete is really outlined by three major things. You know, obviously how they build an emotional connection related to their sport. So things around how close they get, what is the sort of feelings of respect and trust, and how those really build that emotional connection. The other things we want to consider is what are the behaviors that really strengthen the relationship. You know, what does it look like for an athlete or a coach to give that extra effort that really signifies the importance of the relationship that exists. And you know, what's the thinking? What's the kind of the cognitive side where athletes and coaches really are on the same page and make decisions based on strengthening this relationship? And where the role of the parent really comes in is there's huge influence in this relationship that we have here. And so for parents, you know, you play a massive role in the experience, in the sport experience of your child. And you know, while it may look a little different than what you do as a coach, it definitely can impact your relationship with, you know, their athlete and their sport. And so this is meant to just highlight, you know, the important role that you play in your child's sport experience. And obviously right now it's definitely feelings of helplessness, because it's totally natural to think that, because you know, there's just not a lot of context for your athlete to play. And so you're wondering, you know, there's no real opportunities here to really support your athletes because they're not competing, they're not training necessarily. So what can we do? And really tonight is just around some skills that maybe don't necessarily, like I said, provide you with all the answers, but they're just some strategies that you can take moving forward, you know, as you kind of navigate the next couple years of your child's you know, time in sport. So what I also want to highlight here, and I think this is really an important piece as it relates to the context of what we're speaking about, and this is the holistic model that comes from the Indigenous sport participation model. And what this outlines are 4 key concepts that represent, you know, an Indigenous person's identity in sport. And what's really important to highlight here is that all 4 of these are equally important, and all 4 of these play a role in the identity of an Indigenous athlete. And if you think of, you know, where some of the disappointment comes from, obviously from, you know, the lack of opportunity just to actually play, but the opportunity that has been kind of removed from, you know, accessing some of the parts around the mental side of sport, and also the spiritual and cultural significance that sport plays in Indigenous culture. And so this is an important thing to know in terms of, you know, when we're trying to frame where we provide support and why this kind of support is so important, is because we're really trying to highlight, you know, the different areas that really make up an Indigenous athlete. And tonight is really around, I'm going to kind of refer to this as we speak tonight, because it's important for us to understand how we can provide support in these different areas. And so where I kind of want to kind of go with this is to really, obviously the major thing right now with COVID is that it's having an impact on people's mental health in a really significant way. And, right now across Canada, really, there's a huge sort of burnout and fatigue with everything to do related to COVID. And it just can weigh on people. And especially within the context of sport, a lot of athletes, they identify, with the sport that they play. And for a lot of young athletes, it's really what they throw most of their energy into. And so when there's opportunities that are taken away from them in order to, not able to play, not able to compete, not able to attend major games that really represent a significant moment in their life, there's obviously a huge gap there that, needs to be addressed in the appropriate way. And I think the biggest message I want to show you with this slide is that mental health is not separate from physical health. It's just part of your overall health as a human being. And so the discussion that we have tonight is really around supporting a really important aspect of an individual's overall health. And so the challenges that come with this current situation are really kind of rooted into this idea of how can we support athletes and how can we support their mental health, and what are some things that we can do that can really empower them to make decisions that allow them to recover and develop a sense of resilience out of this situation. And so, there's many different things we can talk about COVID has had an impact on sport. And if we talk specifically about the context of the North American Indigenous Games, there is things that are really, they can be really hard to stomach, hard to swallow, is that, there's certain athletes that have been looking forward to these games for a long time. And, the games will eventually continue, but their opportunity to participate may not be there. And so that can be a really hard thing to process, because it can just leave these huge feelings of disappointment and these ideas of what could have been. And there is no escaping some element of that. And that's kind of the honest, difficult thing to discuss, but it's really around what else can we do? What are the important things, and how can we make sure that that person is supported and make sure that that individual gets the care that they need in this difficult situation? And so, even so, for individuals that will eventually compete again, it still doesn't mean that there's all the solutions. It's a great opportunity that they can play, but there's always going to be, because when you take so much time off, there may be fear that they're not as prepared. The comparison and the social impact of what it means to be an athlete, they may generate some worries around that. It can just really have a huge impact in a number of different ways depending on the person. So tonight is really just around outlining some specific things that parents can consider when they're trying to support their athletes in these situations, because COVID has had a huge negative impact on a lot of teens. And it has obviously had a huge impact on the sport landscape in Canada. So what I want to talk about tonight is really, like, when we talk about dealing with the impact of COVID, the word that, it increases stress is commonly used. But what I also really want to highlight here is what we're really dealing with is like a response to grief. And what we want to outline here is that when we are talking about dealing with a situation that we're grieving something, that it means that there's something that we've had, that we've lost, and we don't really want to. It can be a super difficult thing to process. And so, kind of an overview of what the process of grief is as a human being is what you see as follows. Is kind of, if you go on the y-axis, going up the side, there is the morale and the sort of the emotional sort of reactions to different situations, and then on the bottom is how things progress over time. And it's not always this linear sort of relationship. Sometimes we kind of circle back and we kind of repeat sort of moments of the grieving process. But if you kind of go through and think over the past year, you as a parent or you as an athlete have probably experienced all of these things that you see on the page, and then maybe get kicked back a little bit into some earlier stages. And so the initial sort of shock or surprise of the event being canceled then can kind of translate in or move into like a little bit of denial around, looking for evidence that, this can't be true. When that starts to settle a little bit, then the frustration really builds because we realize that, we've had something taken away from us that we really wanted, which can then have a huge impact on, our overall morale and our mood, and where we can have depressed thoughts, where we really lack an energy and lack motivation. And then what we want to try and highlight here is, what's this rebound look like, and what can we do as parents that can enhance and enable this rebound? And when we talk about these different stages, what we want to try and do is line them up with different sort of responses to these situations. And so if you just kind of look at the color code between the graph and the little image on the side, when things are in shock, we're in that kind of shocked state. We really want to create alignment. We want to kind of get everyone together. We want to make sure that everyone has the same information and know that, they're not alone in feeling how they're feeling. And then as frustration sets in, it's really around maximizing communication, and really making sure that these good communication channels are open and that we're doing certain things that really allow the person to feel heard. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. How we then kind of, when people are feeling low in energy, how do we spark motivation? How do we change perspective that, gives a little bit of energy? And then as we kind of develop that, how do we kind of engage and develop the individual to kind of retool themselves with this new situation? So what I really want to focus on tonight are just like these three areas. How do we maximize communication? How do we spark motivation? And how can we develop capability? And I want to have a conversation around a few ideas that, we can kind of share. So if we're kind of starting here with a bit of a communication overview, this is a really simple sort of idea. Is like, as an individual, when you're talking with someone, you have a message. This message that you share to someone, you have to take it, you have to get this idea in your mind, you have to verbalize it in a certain way, and then you have to send that message out into the universe. And that message is then interpreted by someone on the other side, and then ultimately received. And this seems like a pretty straightforward process, but along the way, there can be so much that goes wrong with how this is interpreted. You cannot maybe have your words clearly communicated as how you'd want them to. And then on the other side, the person may not really receive the information as how you intended it to be received. And so this is kind of, we talk about breakdowns in communication, and it's just people on different pages and people not really understanding another person's perspective, which can really impact, a negative kind of communication channel. So I just share this for you to outline communication can be, it looks very simple, but it can be very complicated. And so how we want to maximize communication, especially in this situation as the role of a parent, is how do we really make sure that our communication with our child, what are some things that we can do to really build our communication skills to make sure that our child feels heard in this situation. And so what we kind of go from this is really how we validate a person's experience. And these are just a few things that I want to highlight here, is that when an individual, sometimes when someone's younger than us, for example, when they have a difficult situation occur, sometimes we can always feel that we need to give them the answers right away. But what we don't do in that moment is we don't give the person the opportunity to speak. And so where I kind of want to go here is highlight a few things that really, few examples of how we want to listen first. We want to refrain from giving advice right off the start and try and have some sort of way in which we reframe and try and provide meaning for the individual right away. And just really reaffirm and one way in which we can kind of really maximize communication. And I'm going to provide some specific examples of what this looks like. And so what I want to highlight here are, these three things: how we want to listen first. We want to refrain from using the words, at least you don't have this, at least it's not like this. And when we listen and we can just repeat the words that are said from the individual, what we do is we just open that space where we acknowledge the feelings, which then can then open up the person to other solutions and other ideas. And when we just try and go through what reframing perspective right away without actually validating feelings, what that person feels, what the individual that is giving this message really just doesn't feel heard. they feel like they're isolated. They don't feel like there's any sort of connection with people that they require support from. And so it can be a very challenging thing. And, I've experienced this in my life in terms of as a role of the person that's trying to communicate and the person that's trying to, on the receiving end of this communication. And it can be very, disappointing when you have feelings and you don't feel like you're heard. And so where we want to kind of go with this and talk about a little bit more information about what the power of being heard looks like is a short video. And I want to it really kind of puts into kind of a cool visual of what I just kind of described here. And we're going to talk about how this really relates to our current situation with dealing with the disappointment of moving on past major games that have been canceled. So I'll just play this video. You can turn up your volume and listen in.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, and climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, so there's some really, really important pieces there that I just wanted to highlight is it's outlining a few things there around understanding the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in the situation of dealing with an individual that has gone through a huge disappointment, as people, we can try to be, we always can try to be the fixers of the situation. And, I'm not assuming anyone's sort of reaction to what's happened to their child in the last year with COVID, but just in general with human nature, as it kind of outlines in that video, is if someone shares something that is difficult and uncomfortable, and some of our natural reaction to kind of deflect those kind of difficult feelings can be to try and offer solutions when we're not even really doing the first thing that we need to do in that situation, which is just to really establish that connection. And it's kind of referred to as the 1-2 method of communication. And so when someone shares something that's difficult or a difficult situation with you, and it could be just dealing with the context of having major games canceled, could be many different situations in life. Our initial reaction can be to provide logic or provide reason or provide a different perspective or provide a solution. Try and be a fixer rather than a listener. And that's why it's so important to listen first and try and avoid this sort of reaction of, okay, what can I do in this situation to make it better? And so just kind of repeating, confirming what was said. It's like understanding that, okay, right now you seem really upset by this. I understand how you can feel upset by this. I get that, this is a difficult situation. And just knowing that that is enough in this current moment. And when that person can feel like they're heard, then they're more likely to be open to ways in which they can reframe or restructure what they're going to do now. What's going to be their solution to fixing this problem? And so we start with addressing the feelings, and when the feelings are feelings and they need to be heard, they need to be dealt with. And then what we want to do is when we recognize that that person has experienced like they have been heard in the situation, then it's now the opportunity to change perspective and relate to what they can do in the moment that they can control. And so just you can reflect on your own sort of experience in your life when you've had a difficult moment and you reached out to someone, and what were the things that really resonated with you that made you feel that you developed connection? And it started with just kind of addressing the feelings, and then once those feelings were addressed, then your mind was a little bit more open to looking at solutions and moving forward from the disappointment. And so that's a big thing that I think anyone can kind of take away from understanding how we can manage and offer the best support for people who are dealing with trouble or dealing with disappointing situations. And this is kind of one of the big messages that I want to highlight around how we can really maximize communication. And so, where, I can provide another example here with, an individual who is, say, like a long distance runner, a marathon runner, and they compete, in multiple marathons throughout the summer. They perform really well at a big race. They get like a personal best time. And then they got the next sort of event on their calendar, maybe 2-3 weeks away. This day comes around and they don't perform to their best. And so they get really distraught, and the situation, that you find themselves in the conversations you have with them is they can't believe they didn't finish. How could they not do it? They just did this 3 weeks ago. I'm a failure. I can't even look at my family, like all these sort of things where it's these really sort of kind of uncomfortable feelings that this person is experiencing when they're really kind of questioning their identity and their personality and, their kind of self-worth. And in this situation, if your first response is, oh, well, it's super hot out, you obviously did so well last time, you obviously have lots of ability, don't worry about it. When you try and reframe things kind of based on just kind of like reaffirming or changing perspective for that individual, it may not land well, and they may not really hear you because they're going to be just so upset with the current feelings that they've experienced. And so instead of offering a solution right away, it's just kind of understanding, like, okay, reaffirming how you feel. I understand. I hear, and I can see, and I can feel the disappointment that you're experiencing. And when you start to just kind of acknowledge their feelings and let them know that their feelings are real and that you see them and that you feel them, then, there's an opportunity there for you to change perspective and think like, okay, like if someone else was in your position, like what would you say to them in this moment? And be like, they have courage to try and run. They have, they put myself in a difficult position to try and push myself. And, it's once we kind of like see that opportunity, when we recognize that their feelings have been heard, it's then trying to really outline, okay, not letting them kind of sit in that moment for too long, because once you've opened the door for them to reframe the situation, then that's a strong opportunity to kind of outline like the 1-2 method of communication, where you address feelings first and then offer solutions. And it's really important that it doesn't go in the other way, because the solutions, the reframing, the brain side of things won't land. And so once we've established how, we can really understand, we identify with people in terms of addressing their feelings and making sure that they feel heard, and then redirecting to what they can control. I want to talk a little bit about how we can kind of spark motivation in individuals. And once that opportunity is there to reframe situations, as a parent, what we're trying to do, and especially with COVID, is we're trying to talk about what's the best way to be motivated. And, motivation kind of works on a scale from not being motivated at all to being totally internally motivated. Think about the things you love in life, the passion, the things that are really kind of core to you. And, there's also other types of motivation where it's a means to an end. And that doesn't mean that it's a negative type of motivation. Sport can really be a means to an end. If someone identifies as an athlete and they feel that the values they hold as a human being, and sport is a vehicle to really achieve those values and identify with that part of their life, then they're using sport as a means to an end. And that's an external type of motivation, but it's a really strong one. And so you can kind of see on the very bottom, like the affirmations that we can use that really represent a certain type of motivation. And so what we're trying to do is kind of move all the time. If we are not motivated at all, what it means is that we're lacking certain things around our situation that really take away a feeling of drive and a feeling of passion. And the goal ultimately is try to move from left to right, as you see on the screen here, from not being motivated to being really internally motivated. And sport, and how we do that around sport, can be around highlighting things that a few important pieces of the puzzle here that really allow us to develop this internal sense of motivation. And right now with COVID, it's been really impacted to satisfy like these three basic needs that are really important. We want to have a sense of competence, in our sport, and we want our kids competing to have a sense of self-belief that they can perform. And COVID's taken that away because there's no opportunities or very little opportunities to perform in the context of sport, as in competing at a major games. We've lost a sense of relatedness because we're not connected with teammates or coaches, and so we don't have that ability to socially connect with others. And so that's another important piece. If we want to be really internally motivated in what we're doing, we want to really satisfy this need for being connected with others. And then the third thing, and it's a really important thing, is a sense of freedom or control over your actions, a sense of autonomy. And we don't right now have a total sense of autonomy because there's so many things that we can't do. There's so many things that are controlled that we can't engage with. And so when we're trying to highlight these three things right now in the current context around, trying to be competitive in sport, it can be very, very challenging. And so what we need to do is kind of reframe how we're going to try and address these three basic needs. And it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be, a total solution for everyone, but it's going to be a way in which we can make the most out of a bad situation. And so how we want to try and develop each of these three things, and the role of a parent, what you can do in these three things is, with the sports, with whatever's going on in life, is you can offer, constructive feedback that really shows how maybe the individual is improving in something that they're working on. And so if you don't have an opportunity to play, but you have an opportunity to practice technique, how you can offer constructive feedback and give confidence and acknowledge how they're improving, not just what kids need to work on, but how they can improve, can really develop the sense of competence. And so it's just finding these certain moments to acknowledge improvements, give constructive feedback for things that the individual is working on in the current moment. And so this could be related to sport or other areas of life, but it's important that if we're trying to develop competence, these are things that we want to try and consider when we're giving or when we're working with our kids. And when we're trying to develop a sense of relatedness, this is kind of goes back to that first piece that I talked about around really kind of acknowledging the feelings, listening to what's going on, and really empathizing and not trying to have an answer for everything, but just making sure that the individual feels heard and feels like that their feelings are real, their feelings are validated. And when we can do these things, like just as kind of an outline in that little video, we're really developing the sense of relatedness, which can then be something that can contribute to motivating an individual to try something new in the situation. So there's a little connection between communication and motivation is through the sense of relatedness. And then finally, with developing autonomy, we want to really empower athletes and give them an opportunity to make decisions. This is obviously really impacted right now, but we have to change the context about what they can choose to do. And so encouraging independence and providing rationale of why, providing them information on why certain things are important, and not just, giving orders. This kind of relates to information that coaches can take as well. We can start to really develop the sense of autonomy through this sort of situation. And so if you're wondering like, okay, well, this is all sounds fine, but how do I go about this in the current situation? What can I get my athlete to focus on? And usually like with games and major games, it's usually focused around an outcome, a result, attending a competition, some sort of thing that has like a certain endpoint or certain, opportunity to kind of evaluate the situation. And what we want to really try and work on in this moment, we don't have these outcome goals available to us. We're not going to be going to major games at the current moment. We don't have opportunities to play, to win. So we got to look down the mountain a little bit and not focus so much on outcome goals, which are things related to attending major games or winning or those sort of things. We don't have much opportunity in maybe in some racing sports that are kind of doing some work, that can kind of get away with some COVID safety, or kind of adjust their sport to still be safe, is performance goals. And those are goals that are related to things that you can objectively measure. What we really want to focus on is the process, how we play our sport. What are the things we can focus on that can improve and change the context? Instead of thinking around competition and winning and competing, how can we really adapt this moment in time to really focus on how we do things? How can we develop technique? How can we focus on other parts of sport that are relevant? How can we develop the physical side of our sport? And so these sort of things, when we're trying to develop these three basic needs in people, we want to really do this in a way that focuses on process goals. And so if we say, okay, I hear your feelings, you're disappointed about not going, let's reframe it into a way that really highlights what they can do around the process of how they play their sport. And so what I mean by this, and when we're talking about process goals, is we're really trying to highlight what are the different areas of their sport that are important for them to be, to be competitive in. Because, there's going to be an opportunity to play in the future. So what can we do from a technical side? What can we do from like an understanding of the game from a tactical side? What can we do from a mental side? And what can we do from a physical side? And how can we frame our kids' sport in a way where we're really just focusing on these four things? Not really focusing on the outcome, not really focusing on the results, but really just trying to drive the motivation in order to have these as a focus at this point in time. Because when there does become an opportunity to compete again, it's important to know that athletes that look at these things are things that they can control, and look at things that they can kind of work on and act on. It will have a positive impact on how they can kind of like reframe their current situation. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's one strategy in which we can really support athletes at this moment in time to really focus on what they can do in the current moment to deal with the current situation that's going on. And so if I give you some examples of what I mean by these things in different sports, and so from like an example of like an individual sport, we can work on these sort of things related to the technical side, the tactical side, the mental side, the physical side. Working on things that are within our control, so we can make decisions to act on these things rather than having things like competition need to be and other tournaments and major games that need to be in place in order for us to feel like we're satisfying a need to compete in our sport. So we need to kind of like readjust, reframe things in a way that really allows us to just focus on what we can control. And so how we can work on these things, there's many different areas in which you can kind of look to with coaching and with working out and with working with mental performance coaches, but really understanding like, okay, if this is the situation that I have in this moment in time, I'm not worried about winning tournaments. I'm worried about focusing on these parts of my sport. From a soccer example, working on these different areas of the game and understanding them and kind of being a student of the game in terms of understanding, okay, how am I going to react in different situations? What are the things I need to focus on in order to be an effective soccer player? And how can I take this moment in time to maybe work on some of these things that normally wouldn't get the attention had I been in a competitive season where we're just practicing and playing and practicing and playing. And so this is kind of one sort of way to look at it from a soccer point of view. And if we kind of go to another example with more of a racing sport, what are some things that relate to a racing sport that I can work on in this moment in time? And so this is kind of like this is like the pivot in terms of like how we can kind of acknowledge that, yes, we're not at a moment in time where we can really act on our sport and kind of like achieve some of the maybe the bigger picture goals that we have, but we can pivot and focus on things that are in our control that don't really relate to any sort of competitive season that could be negatively impacted by COVID. And so, these are just some examples of what athletes can do. And I'd be more than happy to follow up with any parents that want to learn more about this stuff and how they can kind of steer their kids in the right direction around looking at these parts of their game when they're trying to when they're trying to figure out, okay, well, what can I do in this moment in time that's relevant to my sport, and that can still give me some meaning and make me feel like I'm doing something worthwhile that's helping me improve. And so what we're really trying to do here is kind of link between the process and the performance. So if I'm looking to try and build like, okay, well, what does a strong race plan look like if I'm, say, like a track athlete or a rowing athlete? I want to try and target specific keywords in the race, and what do I do in certain moments of the race that allow me to react in the right way? And what that performance goal looks like is, I'm going to just increase the speed of my interval times that I can measure and I can work on, without outside competition. And then if I'm looking to improve my strength, a process goal around that is really focusing on proper form and technique. And when I do that, I can really kind of link that to increasing, the amount of weight I can lift in certain exercises. And so these are some examples of, what athletes can do in this moment in time. And that is, it's not perfect. Like I said, there's always going to be that desire to compete and play and experience sport in a really amazing way. But if that's not relevant right now, it's like, okay, well, so what can we do? And this is one strategy that athletes can employ. And so where I want to kind of pivot to next is to speak about, okay, how do we develop some capability in individuals, and how can we really kind of empower people to make decisions that look at the role of sport and how it really plays, a huge impact in their daily life. And I kind of go back to that, the holistic wheel that looks at the cultural, the spiritual, the mental, and the physical aspect of an Indigenous athlete. And when we're trying to really develop capability and have people really reflect on what are the reasons, what's their purpose for playing sport, now is a really important time where we have an opportunity to reflect on what that looks like for ourselves. And so when we talk about finding purpose and finding meaning, and talk about making decisions around not only what we do, but why do we do things? Why do we play sport? Why is it important to us? We talk about this idea around kind of this idea of the golden circle. And what this really involves is, a lot of people, they know what they want to do. Maybe they know how they want to do it. And if we talk about sport, we know what we want to do within sport. We know how we want to compete in our sport. But when we really start to answer the questions of why we play sport, it can really be a powerful exercise to make a connection on some and provide a lot of meaning for why we do things, why we compete in sport, and what role sport has in our life. And obviously, this takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of support for individuals to kind of look inwards in themselves and ask some of these questions. But kind of one strategy and one reason why we might do this is relates to the values that we have and what we value about sport. Because when there is an opportunity to get back to playing, we want to have an understanding of and really know our why in the situation, why we play sport in our life. And so when we're kind of like looking a little bit closer into this, we want to understand, like, how do we create the why? And this can be tied to the motivation piece as well, because from the core of what we're talking about, when we identify the purpose of why we play sport, it can really highlight how we want to do it. And that can kind of go back to that piece around the 4-corner model that I just outlined. What are the daily actions that bring this purpose to life? And from that, then it links to, okay, well, what's the result of these actions? Do I see success? Do I see development? Do I see personal satisfaction in playing sport? And so, as a parent, we want to encourage our children, we want to encourage people to really ask these questions about how do we create our why? And one strategy that we can do that really highlights one approach is to talk a little bit about the role that values play in life. And what do we value? What's our purpose? How can we really outline values that really provide like a guiding light and kind of like a compass for us in difficult moments. And values are different than goals because they're a little bit deeper. Values kind of describe, and provide a little bit of context for different goals that you set. So for example, if I really value being committed to my sport, a goal related to that would be to, make sure that I'm always staying in shape, and that I'm working out and I'm staying physically fit. And that's kind of a goal-driven behavior, but it's influenced by the why. It's influenced by my value of commitment, which has an impact on the goals that I have. And so when in difficult moments, when we experience difficult moments in life and we don't have values to fall back on, we can sometimes make decisions that, in the current moment, in that short-term moment where we felt uncomfortable, it was like an opportunity to get an easy way out of a difficult situation, but we never really get that satisfaction of feeling like we're closer to, fulfilling our purpose as an athlete or our purpose as a student or our purpose as a family member. And so it can really be a foundation for some actions that we can take. And I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail about why, developing capability in people to understand the value or what they value in sport and how those values can really impact, what happens to them in a day-to-day environment is a really important piece of this current situation. And, we have a little bit more time to do this now, with not being totally, bound around preparing for competition, and having the values that we can really kind of set for ourselves is a really important piece of what I wanted to speak about tonight. And so when we're trying to find our own values, like as an athlete, as an individual, and we're talking about within the context of sport, but you can take any context that you want. How do you want others to see you around competition, and how do you want to see yourself when you compete? And when you're training, how do you want people to see you when you're training, and how do you want to see yourself, and how do you want to know how you react to certain situations when you're training? And then what's your role outside of sport? Like, what's the role that you have in your community, and how do you want others to see you, and how do you want to see other people, in the context of, something to do with outside of your sport? And so when we can kind of ask some of these questions to ourselves and reflect on, okay, well, how do I want to see myself in these situations, and how do I want other people to see me in these situations? We can then start to kind of outline some values that are really important to us, some things of what it means to be loyal, what it means to be passionate, what it means to be trustworthy, what it means to have courage, what it means to have honesty. And these sort of things are really an important part of, how sport can teach us life lessons, and how sport can be, a huge role, not only for just our own sort of enjoyment of playing the sport, but the role in which it can make us, it can have a really positive impact on our personal development. And so the role that values have are really central to that. And so this is always a really good time to kind of have conversations with your kids about why you play your sport, and what it teaches you, beyond what lessons are you going to take from this beyond just the current situation. And so, when we're talking about what the role values have, and let's say, there's an opportunity for us to return to sport, or there's an opportunity for us to really, make a decision that, maybe if we can't go back to the North American Indigenous Games as an athlete, maybe we have an opportunity to do so as a coach. And so what role will values have in, these different situations that maybe arise for us? And so when we're talking about why we choose values, I want to provide you an example of why, what would happen. And I think, with values, we can choose to take a situation, related to values relating, we can choose to make a decision that's based on our values, or we can choose to make a decision that's based on how we avoid the current situation. And when I'm gonna explain a little bit of context here, and this is what I kind of just want to finish up with before we can get to any questions that may have arrived, is that when we make a choice directed by our values, it really anchors us in the current moment, and it really anchors us to what we really want out of the situation. And there's going to be times in your life where you face a lot of it, you maybe face adversity, and you have a decision to make in a certain moment where I can choose to stick on the values-driven path in this current situation, or I can choose to make a choice that avoids, that is like the avoidance-driven path. And what the avoidance-driven path, it maybe satisfies a little bit of discomfort in the current moment, But ultimately, if I always choose this avoidance-driven path, then I get farther away from what I really want out of the situation. And so I'm going to give you an example here of, if I just kind of go through this slide, we kind of just covered this sort of lifeline that we have. And so if an athlete, and I'm going to use the context of returning to sport after COVID and the role that values have in helping an athlete make a decision that may be a tough decision, but it's one that where values play a huge important piece in ultimately the athlete making it a decision that really aligns with what they want. So it starts with outlining what we want to have, what values we want to have as a person. And we want to be committed. We want to be dedicated to our sport. We want to be responsible. We want to be a good teammate, a good, we want to be coachable, all those sort of things. And, if we hold these values in place, they're good when things are good, but when things don't go, when you face adversity as an athlete, and as a parent, this is how you can kind of support your athlete in a situation around, there's going to be like a difficult situation. You're going to have to return to sport after a long layoff, and that can bring about a number of uncomfortable emotions. You may be uncertain, you may be, unsure of whether you still have what it takes to compete at the level that you want to compete at. And all these sort of things, all this self-doubt can start to creep in. And so, in this situation, you're really unsure. Your thoughts and feelings related to this situation are really unsure of how, I will perform and what's going to happen, once I get back out on the field or get back involved in my sport. And, if we want to make a decision that really aligns with the values that we hold close to us, we're gonna maybe not choose the avoidance-driven path. But in some situations where values are not there or we're not in touch with those values, we may engage in some behavior that is the easy way out. I take it easy in practice to not embarrass myself. Maybe I don't have the same commitment that I once did because I'm nervous and I'm just really not certain about what's going to happen. So in this moment in time, I take this action that in the moment, it kind of provides a little bit of relief around the situation. But ultimately the consequences of this, is that I may not, apply myself in a way that will really help me get back. And I'll regret this down the line. And so when we recognize this and understand that the role that values have, it allows us to kind of weather the storm. And in this current moment where we may not have all the, the positive feelings, we really connect with our values and ask ourselves what it means to live our life by the values we have and how we can really re-engage with sport in a way that commits to those values. And so if we choose the avoidance-driven path, you're going to go down the right-hand turn there where you're going to take it easy. Sure, you'll protect yourself in the short term, but you may not really convince yourself or make the decision that you really want in the long term. And there may be some regret there, but you look back, it's like, oh, I wish I made this decision differently at this moment in time because, I really wanted to re-engage with my sport, but I just didn't have kind of the courage in that moment to do so. And so empowering athletes to really live by the values and the consequences of having value-driven behavior is that you may be able to, you'll have to suffer at certain moments, but you push yourself and you'll realize that you still can do things and you'll build confidence in being able to really connect with, and overcome a difficult situation and know that, you've had a positive response to adversity. And so, this is an example of how values really play a central role in, how people manage difficult situations. And I just wanted to kind of finish with that and highlight how, as parents, we can be supportive of our athletes and supportive of our kids and finding, what values that they hold in their life as it relates to sport and other areas, and how those can be really a powerful tool for them in certain moments of difficulty and overcoming adversity. And so, if we kind of look back at these three things here about how we really maximize communication, relating to the 1-2 method of communication, how we spark motivation with getting to rethink about the process rather than the outcome, and developing capability around outlining some values that athletes can live by and use when they're trying to re-engage with the new situation that they're going to face. This is what we can do. It's not going to be everything, but it is a response to the current situation. And so I just want to kind of leave you with just that little bit of kind of an outline of around, okay, here are some tools, here's some things that parents can use in these situations that, can have an impact in your athlete's life around, try to return to sport and make a new connection with the current situation. So appreciate you tuning in and listening to me, and I'm open to and happy to answer any questions or comments that you may have.
Hi, Geoff. It's Ali here. Just wondering if parents wanted to get a hold of you or to learn about more or some resources. Sorry, my son has joined me in my office. How can they contact you? What's the best way to look into that?
For sure. I'll put my email here in the chat. And that would be the best way. Just send me an email, and we can set up a phone call, and I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to continue the conversation, because I know there's probably a bit to process with that. And then my goal with these talks here is, like, I guess my approach to working with parents and working with athletes is a kind of really like a tools-based approach. And so, it's really around, it's important for everyone to kind of understand the context of where it's coming from with kind of the human response to grief. And that can be good to understand from like a big picture point of view, but I always kind of, challenge people to kind of ask themselves, okay, well, what can you do in the moment? What can you do now, knowing with new information? And so, taking some of these things that really relate to some of the different things I talked about is not meant, you're not meant to have all the answers right away, because no one ever does, but it's like trying to kind of plant the seed of, how we can approach new situations that we're going to face with our athletes in the future. And what can we do? What are different ways that we can react and support our athletes when they face adversity? And what are the things that we can reinforce and re-encourage? And how can we start to have some of these conversations as they relate to, some really practical things that parents can do, with their athletes, to manage, not fix, but manage, these difficult situations with dealing with COVID and returning to sport after COVID, and managing the disappointment of losing out on experiences with COVID. It's all meant to really try and provide more tools for your toolkit as a parent.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Geoff, for leading this session. Masai, everyone, for joining. If anyone is interested in being informed when this webinar will be live, we can pop me an email or Geoff an email, and we'll be sending that information to Geoff as well. And we look forward to seeing everyone in our future webinars. Thank you so much, Geoff. Masai.
Thank you so much for having me, and enjoy your evening, everyone.